It is a story of unimaginable evil.
You've never seen a crime like this. Compare it to Jack the Ripper or the Yorkshire Ripper.
It's been a decade since Josef Fritzl was jailed for his horrific crimes.
10 years on, this is one of the offences that most disturbs people.
Holding his daughter Elizabeth prisoner in his cellar for 24 years.
The only person she could depend on is this monster who comes and rapes her whenever he feels like it. It's undescribable.
Fritzl forced her to have 7 children with him and even murdered one of the babies.
Fritzl got rid of Michael's body by putting him in the household incinerator, and this just beggars belief.
So what happened to his daughter after her escape, and her children?
Her survival instinct would have meant that if she died or she gave up, her children would give up.
How are they still trying to rebuild their lives?
The absolute courage she must have had is really a testament to her individual resilience.
And what made Josef Fritzl a monster?
Mr. Fritzl told me that he thought he was born a rapist. He was born to rape.
Fritzl was put behind bars exactly 10 years ago, but he spent much of this time expecting to be freed.
Fritzl hasn't shown any remorse. No sense of reality, actually.
And the detective who first exposed his crimes exclusively reveals the letter sent to him by the Fritzl children. In his first television interview about the case that shocked the world.
Von einem Mädchen kann man in diesem Fall.
In this case, you can't speak of a human being. What he did, I don't know. There aren't the words to describe him.
Exactly.
April the 19th, 2008. In the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten, a 19-year-old girl is rushed to hospital after falling critically ill. Her name is Kerstin. Her only visitor is an elderly man.
Josef Fritzl called an ambulance who took Kirsten to hospital. He turned up the following day saying that the only person she was to have any contact with was her grandfather, Fritzl himself.
Fritzl's story was that Kerstin had been suddenly dumped on his doorstep by his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, who he claimed had run away from home to join a cult more than 20 years before. The case of Elizabeth was well known in Amstetten. Journalist Mark Perry covered her disappearance in the 1980s.
The first time I got in contact with the case was when he and his wife contacted the police to say Elizabeth was missing. The police approached us and said, please put this picture of Elizabeth Fritzl in the newspaper so we might find her. This is the very first article written on Elizabeth Fritzl. I remember that. I had the handout given to me by the police. That's when she went missing as a 16-year-old. And that's when she was last seen with her boyfriend. And it says here, and I wrote this, it's going a long time back, 1983, 1st of February. So the very worldwide first article written about Elizabeth Fritzl.
But in 2008, Elizabeth was still thought to be a missing person. In hospital, Kerstin fell into a coma. The police put out a TV appeal for Elizabeth to finally come forward.
Of course, Elizabeth Fritzl was the accused, the lady who had dumped her children with her father. We need to find Elizabeth Fritzl. Where is she? Anyone who knows where she is, contact the police.
Days later, Elizabeth suddenly appeared. Unbeknown to the authorities, she'd actually seen the appeal on the TV in her underground prison at Fritzl's home and begged him to take her to the hospital. It was her first trip outside for nearly a quarter of a century.
The police were waiting for them. They wanted to charge Elizabeth with neglect of her child.
As the pair were taken to Amstetten's police station, a truth was about to be revealed which would horrify the world. He didn't know it, but policeman Willy Reitner would be the first person to speak to Elizabeth about her terrifying ordeal.
First of all, Elizabeth was accused and was interrogated because of child abduction.
More than 10 years on, this was the first television interview the policeman has ever given about the case.
Elizabeth's appearance was fairly well kept. Of course, her skin color was strange. She didn't have a single wrinkle. She didn't seem to have any problems with her teeth. She had shoulder-length hair.
But as the interview continued, it became clear where Elizabeth had been all along.
Then she broke down crying, said, "If you're ready to listen to me, I've got a horrendous story to tell, but please, please believe me."
Elizabeth Fritzl told Willy Reitner that her own father had locked her in an underground cellar for 24 years and raped her thousands of times.
For me, it only sunk in hours later. I was so busy with the interrogation, and because Elizabeth was so precise with all the details.
They couldn't believe what they were hearing because Josef Fritzl was a pillar of the community. Eventually, they had to check this out. They went to the house.
What police found on this quiet residential street, hidden from view, was a terrible secret. A purpose-built cellar. A prison for Elizabeth. Lured there by her father when she was just 18.
Josef Fritzl came to her bedroom and woke her up and said, "I need your help." He was fitting the door, the very heavy concrete and steel door, to this nuclear bunker, and said, "You must come down and help me." When she came down there, he knocked her out with chloroform, pushed her inside and locked the door.
The entrance to the living quarters was concealed behind shelves. There was a 3-foot-high reinforced door secured electronically with a code only Fritzl knew. Fritzl had applied for planning permission to develop the basement of his home years before seizing Elizabeth. A narrow corridor led to 3 tiny chambers. The first was a small living area with basic cooking facilities, toilet and shower. Through another narrow corridor, there were 2 bedrooms, each containing 2 beds. There was no natural light and barely any room to move freely.
It was so well hidden that the authorities needed time to find it. There was a small passageway. I could barely fit through it with my shoulders.
Piece by piece, Elizabeth's ordeal was being revealed, and it was a story that Mark Perry would be the first to break worldwide.
Basically, it was a tip-off by the police. Yes, they just gave me a confidential phone call. "Mark, get on the way. Get down here to Amstetten. Move fast, because you've never seen a crime like this. Compare it to Jack the Ripper or the Yorkshire Ripper," he said.
It must have been absolutely terrifying for her. It would have been damp, it would have been dank, it would be smelly, and the only person she could depend on is this monster who comes and rapes her whenever he feels like it. It's undescribable.
For 4 years, Elizabeth was alone in the basement, visited only by Fritzl to carry out his gruesome assaults. Her father's incestuous abuse led to the birth of her first child, Kirsten, in the tiny cellar.
She finds herself pregnant with her father's child. She knows that no midwife or doctor's going to turn up. And then she knows that she's going to have to bring it up, her first daughter, Kirsten, in this hellhole.
It does seem odd at first that Fritzl allowed Elizabeth to get pregnant in the first place. Surely this is a headache for him. It's more people that he's got to look out for. But actually what we've got here is somebody who wants to exercise control and wants to wield power.
It may be that it was just one more cruel and sadistic thing to do to her because she was completely bent and broken to do what he wished.
Over the next 14 years, Elizabeth gave birth to 6 more of her father's children.
The second one was a son. The third one cried a lot, and so he decided that he couldn't keep the child down there.
To avoid being found out, Fritzl took the noisy baby upstairs to the house he shared with his unsuspecting wife, Rosemary, who believed Elizabeth had run away. To further convince his wife, he forced Elizabeth to write a note claiming the religious cult she was with didn't approve of children. He would later take 2 more children out of the cellar to live upstairs.
And each of the subsequent children, which were apparently abandoned with their grandparents, were also accompanied by a letter saying, I'm not capable of looking after this child. I know that you will look after them. So that keeps a narrative going for many, many years.
The upstairs children would grow up believing their mother had abandoned them, unaware that she and their siblings were trapped beneath them.
Everyone believed they were really Elizabeth Fritzl's children because she left them on the doorstep as babies. Everyone thought of her as a bad mother, who was a runaway, who was getting pregnant all the time, but no suspicion at all. Even I believed the story.
Josef had left 4 of the children he had fathered with Elizabeth in the cellar, but only 3 would ever be set free.
One of the twins that died wasn't even named, and Josef Fritzl took his body and just flung it in the incinerator. He was only named later as Michael.
She told the police. Fritzl took that little one away, and Fritzl confessed to that.
Well, Fritzl apparently got rid of Michael's body by putting him in the household incinerator, and this just beggars belief. It you know, makes most of us feel absolutely disgusted.
For the children that remained, the only life they knew was that of an underground prison.
Most of the time, they just had to sit around and do nothing and contemplate their situation. I can't imagine anything worse.
They lived their lives without knowing whether it was daylight or darkness, whether it was morning or evening. He basically locked all his second family into the dungeon, cramped conditions. I mean, he did bring toys down, and he did celebrate birthdays.
Got to remember, this is a man who was showing those children photographs of their siblings who had been released from the basement and tormenting them, giving him some sort of perverse pleasure and control.
That just shows how heartless, how emotionless he was.
There were further signs of attempts to create some sense of a normal life for them.
What was noteworthy for me was that there was a goldfish there in a glass of water that was obviously brought down from upstairs.
They had a few books that Elizabeth tried to teach them to read and write, which they did to a certain standard, but then she wasn't a trained teacher.
Elizabeth Fritzl could hardly stand, because it's just the height of a human being, a grown-up human being. They had a television down there, which they could use, but that was about all.
But as the secret family was finally freed by police, there were more shocks to come. The full extent of their ordeal and the scale of Fritzl's depravity can now, 10 years on, be revealed. Josef Fritzl built a dungeon for his own daughter, Elizabeth, and kept her prisoner there for 24 years. she was repeatedly raped and gave birth to 7 of her own father's children.
I remember feeling utter shock, devastated, and I was so... It broke my heart, actually, knowing the little children down there.
As the family was freed and Fritzl was arrested by police, the world's media descended on the small Austrian town of Amstetten.
It was swarming. Hundreds of journalists from all over the world, you name it. India, Indian Broadcasting Corporation, even Australia, all over the world. And of course, a lot of British journalists.
There was a clamour for the truth. How had Fritzl managed to keep his awful secrets hidden for so long?
When you look at it today, the logistical exercise he must have had to undertake in the cellar, to take care of the children and to get rid of the rubbish, so that no one around realized what was going on, that says something.
Josef Fritzl, he took in many, many tenants during the time that Elizabeth was in captivity. Some of them did get a little bit suspicious. There was a tenant that heard knocking noises, and Fritzl explained the system.
There was intense media speculation that Fritzl's wife, Rosemary, must have known what was happening beneath her home. But she was innocent, completely taken in by his lies.
She didn't know anything, but nobody had a hint because the dungeon was hidden. And Fritzl did everything to disguise his crimes.
He'd told Rosemary that Elizabeth had run away and only returned to dump several children on their doorstep. He also lived in a completely separate part of their house and explained his time in the cellar by saying he was away on business.
It does seem absolutely incredible that his wife wouldn't know what was going on downstairs in the cellar. And many people say, well, how could she have been fooled by him? And I'd say it's not so much about being fooled by him, it's about being controlled by him.
But Fritzl lost control when he allowed his secret daughter Kirsten to go to hospital when she fell ill, and then allowed Elizabeth to persuade him she needed to be there too. As he languished in prison awaiting trial, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Heidi Kastner interviewed Josef Fritzl face to face.
My first impression was that Mr. Fritzl was as normal as you can be. Yeah, he was an ordinary man. The question I had when I came there was, would he talk to me? So I was very relieved when he told me that he would talk to me and that he would answer all my questions. I saw him 6 times for quite a long time, for about 20, 24, 25 hours.
During those hours of interviews, Dr. Kastner learned things about Fritzl's emotional intelligence.
He knew what he did was wrong, but I think he didn't have the emotional depth to grasp what he had really done to his daughter. His emotional vocabulary was very small, and he had also difficulties in describing his own feelings. It was like talking to a telephone directory. He was very good at presenting facts, but he was very, very inept at describing his emotional needs.
But the most important question Dr. Kastner had to answer was whether or not Josef Fritzl was fit to stand trial.
There was no derangement or illness that would have prevented him from living an ordinary life. And that's what made him capable to stand trial, because he was not ill. He was not mentally insane.
In March 2009, at the age of 73, Josef Fritzl was brought before court, with the world watching on.
Of course, the same situation in front of the courthouse as it was down in Amstetten. People swarming, journalists swarming, 30 or 40 TV teams, hard to get the place inside the courtroom.
The media were only allowed a glimpse of the defendant at the start of each day. Fritzl didn't want to show his face.
He had some sort of a brochure hiding his face, like this. No remorse, no compassion for anyone on earth but himself. No tears, nothing. Just staring, just like it was normal procedure, just like he was going to the doctors or somewhere else.
By holding that up across his face, he is protecting himself. He'd be exquisitely uncomfortable because he can't hide any longer. He's been hiding his sexual crimes in a basement for years. It's inevitable that he will want to avoid, and interestingly enough, the courts in Austria allow him to do that.
Fritzl showed little sign of remorse, at first denying some of the charges.
He admitted all the charges except for two, which were murder by neglect of Michael and enslavement.
He didn't show any remorse. He was very, very arrogant. Why? I didn't harm them. I didn't do anything. That's not a kidnapping. Basically, they were down there voluntary.
There were rumors that Elizabeth secretly attended the trial.
I saw him during the trial, of course, because he was there. He was there for all 4 days. And there was one point when he was shocked, is too strong a word, but when he was obviously moved, that was when he realized that the daughter was present. And it was obviously something that was not what he had expected, and it was something that he didn't want.
For the person that's been released from captivity, that might be an important thing for them if it moves to a prosecution stage, that they actually want to be involved in that stage of it, or to witness that what they've done and their actions have led to some sort of fulfillment. And that may be something that satisfies them.
But after only 3 days in the dock, the man who'd appalled the world stunned everyone once again.
After sitting through the hours of video testimony from Elizabeth, he admitted the last two charges. It didn't make much of a difference because he would have got life imprisonment anyway on the rest of them. So he just gave up.
Josef Fritzl confesses to everything. He says he's guilty of absolutely everything, and that's because of the effect of Elizabeth's testimony that he'd heard in court. Now, I don't buy that for a minute. I don't think somebody like Fritzl develops a conscience overnight or grows a sense of integrity.
I think it was because he had totally lost control. He could see the way this was going. Everything was going to be exposed in the coming days of what he had done, and by suddenly changing his plea, he regained control again.
It's been 10 years since Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment in a high-security psychiatric hospital. He was behind bars at last, but what do those who knew him think made him a monster? Born in Amstetten in April 1935, Fritzl was an only child. It's claimed his upbringing by his mother was cold and loveless.
So Mr. Fritzl grew up without father. Times were very difficult, and she seems to have had a very difficult character. She was very impulsive and a hard woman. That's the way he described her.
Well, Fritzl, it's been claimed, was an alibi child, so his mother had him to prove that she wasn't infertile, and his relationship with his mother has been reported to be an incredibly volatile one.
When she was in a bad mood, she begged him. He was the one who had to bear all her moods. And he never knew when such an eruption would be coming.
Karl Dunkel went to school with Josef Fritzl.
Das erste Bild ist aus dem Jahre 1947.
The first picture is from 1947. That was during secondary school, which Fritzl and I attended together. That's him there.
Da ist dann drauf.
Fritzl was an intelligent chap at school. He was 1.5 years older than us, so he was more mature. 1.5 years is a lot at this age. He was an absolutely intelligent student. a calm and inconspicuous student.
Growing up in a single-parent family in those days was rare.
We used to invite him to come and play in our garden because we knew he had no father. We did not know who his father was or whether he was still alive. We often invited him to play with us, the kind of games boys play, pretending to be Indians, because we felt sorry for him, as he had no father.
In his teens, Fritzl began to carve out a career.
This was in 1951. There is Josef Fritzl. He can be seen in the middle. He later went on to become an engineer.
Well, when Fritzl went out into the workplace as a young man, he was very interested in engineering and electrics. And if you think of those fields, those disciplines, they're about order, they're about certainty, they're about predictability.
At the age of 21, he married Rosemary, who was 17 at the time.
When Rosemary first met Josef Fritzl, he made quite a good impression on her family, and I think that does speak to his superficial charm. But it wasn't long before the real Fritzl emerged. He's been described as a despot, as a real domineering man.
The first indication of his criminal nature came in 1967, when he was convicted of rape, but his wife stood by him.
Fritzl raped a local woman. He broke into her house to do so. And he served a year in prison for this crime. Now, in terms of how his wife Rosemary explained this to the children, she said that he'd gone away to work for a year, so it really was brushed under the carpet.
Mr. Fritzl described himself as being born a rapist, but I don't know if he was born like that. He developed that need, that urge, I think also as a consequence of what he had to live through as a child.
So you find sometimes in children who've been abused the development of abnormal sexual fantasies. And you can see many elements in this. You can see the anger towards women, hatred towards women, the need to control women.
He also said alongside that he had an evil streak. And what he's doing there is he's trying to say there's something in me that I can't help myself. So he's kind of absolving himself of responsibility here, saying this is something that's beyond my control.
Fritzl's first crime was hidden from all.
Because of the statute of limitations in Austria, those things have been removed from the record, so nobody knew what had happened when he was younger.
He was convicted earlier for rape, and this made him think about how to do what he wanted to do without being caught. And he found the perfect solution.
Josef Fritzl locked his daughter Elizabeth underground for more than 8,500 days. He repeatedly raped her and fathered 7 children, 6 of whom survived.
A decade on, it's deeply shocking. This is something which is not out there in the street. This is not somebody essentially running amok. This is somebody whose perversion, whose violence, whose control and containment and destructive behavior is contained secretly within a family.
Their eventual escape came when the eldest child, Kirsten, was rushed to hospital, and Elizabeth was allowed above ground. Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life in prison for what he did. But what happened to Elizabeth? Locked in a cellar as a teenager and only freed as a woman in her 40s, she was forced to be strong at a young age. When Fritzl's abuse began, she was only 11.
She began running away, but because she was underage, he could get the police to bring her back again. And nobody asked any questions why she was running away, where it's now plain why she didn't want to be at home.
So basically a normal girl but a strong girl with her own mind, her own will. And that must have been the reason why Fritzl picked her, destroyed her life, didn't he?
She was the person who was most determined not to follow his rules. And I think when you want to wield power over people, often when you seek to break somebody who is very strong-willed, you get more satisfaction out of that than if you try and break down somebody who is quite easy to manipulate anyway. So I think she was a bit of a project for him.
The first person to hear the devastating details of Elizabeth's ordeal was Willie Reitner of the Amstetten police. She told him of the existence she was made to endure for 24 years.
Es war eine gewisse Zeit, wo sie
She was broken.
geknickt worden ist,
Broken like a dog.
wie man einen Hund knickt. Und da ist man,
And then you're not quite human anymore, in my opinion.
meine Meinung,
It must have been psychological terror.
muss ein Psychoterror gewesen sein.
This is one of the most shocking cases I've ever come across of trauma. It's repeated trauma by somebody who's known to the victim, and it's kidnapping, and it has elements of torture. So it's one of the most severe forms of trauma that somebody can go through.
And the only crumb of comfort that you could get from it was just how strong Elizabeth was. To survive that without going crazy, without killing herself. It's most extraordinary.
Human beings have all kinds of survival mechanisms designed to keep us safe and sane, even in situations of prolonged incarceration or imprisonment. And they could include things like people invent mind games. I know some captives who wrote entire novels in their head. She might have exercised, looking forward to meals punctuates the day. Hope is another big one, making fantasies about future, a better future or a better present.
For some people, it will be dreaming about places they've been before. For other people, it will be thinking about the future. For others, it will be something like counting bricks in a wall.
For the first 4 years of her imprisonment, Elizabeth was alone. Her only other human contact was with her father. But then, with the arrival of her first child, Kerstin, her method of survival changed.
Sie hat Kinder geboren,
She gave birth to children,
hat diese
brought them up,
großgezogen,
gave them a
hat
life.
diese ein Leben vermittelt,
She also tried to teach them to read and write.
schreiben und lesen zu lernen.
The absolute courage she must have had to birth children without any intervention from midwives or the hospital is really a testament to her individual resilience.
Human beings are designed to survive, and that mothers are designed and equipped to care for children, then she would have been doing her job, essentially.
Her survival instinct would have meant that if she died or if she gave up, her children would give up, her children would die. And I can imagine that that would really have kept her going.
As soon as she can focus on something else, it stops her introverting and looking at herself and worrying about herself. So all her stresses and strains can be put into making sure that everyone else is looked after, that they're taught, that they're clean, that they're fed, that they sleep properly, and that they're cared for.
But Elizabeth's children also had to deal with their awful day-to-day lives.
Because my lads were same age, basically, at that time. And I felt such pity. You see, a child never been able to play in a playground, just been stuck in these cramped conditions, not like a normal child.
Children are very, very adaptive in that intensely threatening situation. And one possible psychological defence that they would have used is something called dissociation. So whilst they couldn't physically remove themselves from that terrible situation unravelling in front of them, so they float away in their mind, and for them it's as if they're not really there.
Elizabeth had known the outside world before she was taken captive. But 3 of her children had never seen daylight until they were freed. The youngest was Felix, who was just 5 at the time.
And the police constable told me when he was taken out of the dungeon for the first time, he couldn't take all the lights, all the impressions, he couldn't take it in.
But perhaps more surprisingly, Felix was also excited.
I remember one thing. I said to a colleague of mine that they should drive slowly in the car, because the children aren't used to driving in a car. But it turned out differently. The little one was really excited, saying, "Great, at last I can drive in a car like on TV."
And remarkably, according to her doctor, eldest child Kirsten enjoyed the same things as other teenagers.
While still in a hospital bed, she was listening to Robbie Williams until 3 in the morning.
One of the descriptions of the responses of the kids was the boy laid on the grass and stroked the grass for a long time, and watching clouds blow by was an enormous treat for them.
It would have taken them many weeks and months for their mind to acclimatise to new experiences so that they could make sense of what they were seeing.
It's now known that during their hospital treatment, the doors linking the family's rooms were left open at all times.
The memory of the trauma influences the body and the physiology of the body, so people tend to be a lot more hyper-alert and hyper-aroused and very, very vigilant and on guard for danger.
Darkness, or certain sounds, certain smells, perhaps the sound of a door opening and closing. Their brain would have associated those sounds with danger.
As for Elizabeth, it's been reported that shortly after her release, she became obsessed with cleanliness, showering up to 10 times a day.
Usually when people go through trauma, they interpret the traumatic event to mean something about themselves, such as I'm inadequate, I'm different, I'm vulnerable.
With such a delicate case, doctors would have had to ease Elizabeth back into the world gently.
Don't want to impose on her. You want to help her regain a sense of ownership of her own life, so she can come and go as she pleases. She's the boss in this. She directs it, and we go at her pace.
But it wasn't just those released from the cellar who needed help adjusting. 3 of Elizabeth's children were taken to live upstairs in the house by Josef Fritzl. Alex, Lisa, and Monica believed they had been abandoned by their mother. Reuniting them with Elizabeth and their siblings would not have been simple.
The upstairs children, they had had a life. They went to school, they had friends, they had all of the things that normal kids have.
They would have experienced a whole range of emotions, of relief, but also possibly guilt at not having been through the same as their siblings and their mother. Shame, fear. It would have been a very complicated process to reconnect and rediscover that actually their mother never wanted to lose them.
The woman who raised the upstairs children, Rosemary Fritzl, also believed they'd been abandoned by Elizabeth after she ran away.
I think that Elizabeth and Rosemary's relationship is going to be, and always will be, a very complex one. I think initially when Elizabeth was released from captivity, she'd missed her mother. She hadn't seen her for years, and there was quite a joyous reunion. But I don't think it would have taken long for quite a lot of resentment to seep in.
Rosemary now lives in another city, around 40 miles away from the home she shared with Josef Fritzl. It's reported she visits Elizabeth and the children at least once a week. Their relationship is said to be continuing to recover. But what of the future? 10 years on, why does Josef Fritzl still believe he has one final shock for the world? And will Elizabeth and her children ever have a chance at a hopeful ending to their story? Elizabeth Fritzl spent nearly a quarter of a century locked in a cellar. There she was raped over and over again by her own father, Josef Fritzl. Her escape came after one of the children she had by him was taken to hospital in a critical condition. After initially being suspected of child neglect, Elizabeth revealed the truth to police.
While she was being interrogated, she initially maintained the fiction that she had been with this strange religious sect. Eventually, once she got the police to assure her that she and her children would never have to see Josef Fritzl again, she told the truth, exactly what had happened to her, and they couldn't believe their ears.
For years, Elizabeth was kept hidden from the world. But her country could not hide from the perception that this kind of crime was a strangely Austrian phenomenon. The Fritzl case came less than 2 years after another kidnapped Austrian woman escaped, this time after being held captive by a stranger. Natascha Kampusch was just 10 when she was imprisoned in a cellar for more than 8 years just outside Vienna.
It got very claustrophobic in that small room, and I threw water bottles or banged my fist against the walls, so that maybe someone could hear me.
I
don't know, it was horrific. And if he had not taken me up into the house at some point, to have a bit more space to move, I think I might have gone crazy.
Natascha's decision to speak also gave some insight into what Elisabeth Fritzl's ordeal must have been like. And when Natascha heard about Elisabeth's story, she donated £20,000 to help her. But the similarities didn't go unnoticed.
It had a ramification for the whole of Austria, because you see, we had the Kampusch case, the girl being held in a cellar, so it's the way the world viewed us, like still being Nazis.
Similar crimes have since come to light around the world.
We've seen cases from all over the world in recent years. We've seen the case of the 3 women in the US who were released after 12 years or so of captivity under their captor Ariel Castro.
In 2013, 3 women in Cleveland, Ohio, escaped after being held prisoner for more than a decade. Their kidnapper, Ariel Castro, had abducted them, locked them in his house, and abused and raped them. One of the women had a child. The other 2 women had to look after mother and baby.
There are similarities between Josef and Elizabeth and Ariel Castro and the kidnappings that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. The main similarities are the children that were born and how having these kids actually kept the women who were in captivity going, because they were then having to care for them and look after them, and it gave them a focus as well as more companionship.
Their escape only came after Castro left a door unlocked, and one of the women was able to alert neighbors. He was jailed for life plus 1,000 years, but killed himself just 1 month into the sentence. But the story that has lingered longest in people's minds is that of Elisabeth Fritzl. It has even gone on to inspire works of fiction. The novel and subsequent film Room were, according to their author, triggered by the Fritzl case.
Why the aliens never scream back?
I guess they still can't hear us.
We'll do even louder, okay?
Room tells the story of a woman trapped for 7 years in a shed. She, like Elizabeth, is repeatedly raped and has a son by her captor.
I think Room is an excellent portrayal of what somebody might have experienced if they'd been kidnapped and mothered a child whilst in captivity. The authors are trying to get inside the mind and the psychology of the person who's kidnapped. And I think Room portrays that quite well.
A wall's like this. See, and we're on the inside, and Mouse is on the outside.
I can't see the outside side.
In fiction, you can step inside Elizabeth's head and her heart, which I think is what fiction's for.
But if Austria slowly came to terms with Fritzl's crimes, the town of Amstetten has found it hard to cast off Fritzl's shadow.
All of us, I have to say, were shell-shocked about what happened. None of us could imagine that this could have happened. We were thunderstruck.
In Amstetten, there were many people remorseful, because why didn't we notice anything? But that's in any criminal case, isn't it? So everybody thought we are all guilty.
You would come out of the house and see TV crews in Amstetten. At the beginning, no one seemed to mind. But in hindsight, you sort of felt ashamed for him. Well, in the town, there was a big uproar. The interest from the media was huge. Amstetten was totally taken over by the media for 2 or 3 weeks. And in the media, they always said, the case Amstetten, never the Fritzl case.
Nie befallen, Fritzl.
When Elizabeth was finally freed, the local community held a vigil in the town in solidarity with her and her children.
They were shocked, they were sad. I saw people weeping, I saw people punching the fists into the air. Nobody could believe it.
Today, the people of Amstetten still struggle to put the past behind them. The cellar where Elizabeth spent 24 years has been filled in with concrete. A decade after Fritzl's conviction, the house he owned has been sold and turned into flats. Residents say that while they are horrified by what happened there, life has to move on. But not everyone agrees.
I wouldn't like anyone to live in there. I couldn't. With all the ghosts of the past haunting the house, ghosts of Elizabeth Fritzl and, of course, little Michael, the little lad who was burnt. Personally, I think they should have got rid of the house. They should have razed it to the earth because it's as ugly as the monster that lived in there. When I go back to Amstetten, I can't go there without feeling sorrow, without feeling the same shock. People don't want to be reminded of this horrendous crime. They want to put it back. Fritzl is none of us, no longer. But people don't like to talk about it because he was amongst them. But I think the wounds are healing now.
But more than a decade after his terrifying secret was discovered, in Josef Fritzl's mind, nothing has changed.
He did write a letter to Elizabeth Fritzl saying he'd like to meet her again and how is she and how are the children doing. He tries to keep contact from his cell, but she doesn't want anything to do with him.
He has the ability to never give up, and he was planning on a future life with his wife and going hiking with the wife, and he was obviously planning on coming out and also reversing his verdict.
He shows no remorse up to this day. He still thinks he was the loving father, and he still thinks if he walked free, they would all come to meet him. No sense of reality, actually. So he still thinks Elizabeth, yeah, she'd like me, she'd love me, she still loves me.
But in reality, 10 years on from Fritzl's conviction, Elizabeth hasn't seen or spoken to her father. He is serving his life sentence in a prison in northern Austria. No one comes to visit him.
In some cases where the crime is so extreme, they may be kept for much of their time solitary from the other prisoners, but usually they're on a wing with other sex offenders.
And he allegedly lives under the watch of guards after being attacked by other inmates and losing teeth.
There's a pecking order within the prison system, and those who abuse children and indeed rapists are low down the pecking order. And this happens if they're not protected.
It's also been recently reported that Josef Fritzl has changed his name in a bid for anonymity. He's now said to go by the name of Josef Meyerhoff.
I think what he's doing here is engaging in impression management. He's always concerned about what other people think of him, so I think this is just testament to his narcissism.
In terms of changing his name, it's very simple. I mean, there's two things to say. First, it's really not uncommon for very serious offenders and those who've committed sexual offences to change their name. But I think the timing of it's more interesting in that he thinks he's getting out.
I think he's got the kind of emotional emptiness of a psychopath, but he's also got the egotism and the entitlement that comes with narcissism. And I think it's a very toxic combination of those two things.
His days are now spent carrying out menial cleaning tasks in the prison. Fritzl's sentence came with no chance of parole for 15 years. And at the age of 83, there are reports that his health is deteriorating. He's said to barely leave his cell. But perhaps more disturbingly, in late 2017, evidence of another secret basement, was found in a property he used to own. It's not known if any crimes took place there. Josef Fritzl remains a lonely prisoner. But a decade on, what happened to Elizabeth? And what happened to the children?
If you are so severely traumatized and abused, can you ever get over that?
It's been 10 years since Josef Fritzl was convicted of his terrible crimes, imprisoning his daughter for 24 years and fathering 7 children with her. But Elizabeth Fritzl and her children are attempting to move on and lead normal lives without the evil presence of their father. And there is a hope of a brighter future for them all. Now she and her 6 children live in a secret location known only as Village X.
Elizabeth is leading a next to near normal life with her children somewhere in Austria. Not even the closest relations know where they are, but they are going on with their life.
She is now at a location with her family that is not known to the public. In my personal opinion, she's doing well. The kids are also doing well.
A lot of money was spent keeping them in the local Wow clinic and reacclimatizing them to the real world. Whether that's possible or not, who can tell? And of course, everybody thankfully respects their privacy.
Specific details of their lives are limited, and unlike other victims of similar crimes, none of the Fritzl children have recounted their ordeal.
In some cases, the captive, once released, will just want nothing to do with it and will try to walk away and say, I'm doing nothing. And their coping mechanism may be to bury the whole situation.
Some details, however, have been snatched from friends and acquaintances. According to interviews with people who know her, Elizabeth has passed her driving test and now enjoys everyday tasks, such as shopping.
I expect that Elizabeth will experience joy around the little things in life that other people are more likely to take for granted because she had them for a period of time. They were taken for over 20 years, and then she has them again, so she will really cherish quite small things.
It's also been reported that Elizabeth, now in her 50s, has found love and even married. But she also has a new identity, which is strictly protected.
I think it would be a little unusual if she didn't have some trust issues, given what she's gone through. But we all have trust issues to some degree or another. And it's entirely possible, if she wants to, and for her to work through them to the point where she can have satisfactory relationships.
As for the children kept in captivity with Elizabeth, it's reported Kirsten loves music, Stefan wants a career as a ship's captain, and Felix attends a local school.
Nobody knows what scars they'll have, which way they'll turn, how the impact. Nobody can really say what it was or what it is.
It's entirely possible for any of the children, whether they were 5 years old or 19 years old, to emerge healthy enough to live a normal life.
People have been more compliant the longer they've been in, and so are subject to a form of self-conditioning, where they get themselves used to what is going to get them through the day. Changing those behaviours after a really long period takes an awful lot.
With the right treatment, and with treatment for long enough, it's certainly possible that Elizabeth and her children would get to a place psychologically where they feel they can integrate with society.
For the policeman who first heard Elizabeth's story and helped to free her, there are also positives. Willie Reitner receives text messages from Elizabeth and her children, wishing him well every Christmas and Easter. And shortly after Elizabeth's release, she and her children wrote a letter to him, which he keeps close by, in the hope her family can have a bright ending to their terrible story.
Thank you for helping us. You were there for us in a difficult situation. When we needed your support the most, you took care of us without great fuss. The experience of someone sticking by us, supporting us unconditionally, was like a gift to us. We are confident that we're not alone with people like you supporting us. We hope that you have someone supporting you if you ever need help.